Back in the day, greenhouses didn't need electricity or gadgets. Grandma kept hers going through snow and frost using things like quilts, barrels, and even manure. These old tricks made it possible to grow food in the dead of winter. Most people don't use them anymore, but they still work. Here are 20 forgotten greenhouse methods that helped families grow food all year. Cold frames inside the greenhouse. When winter really bit down, Grandma didn't just rely on the greenhouse alone. She built cold frames inside it for an extra layer of protection. These were low wooden boxes with clear lids, resembling mini greenhouses within a larger greenhouse. During the day, they trapped solar heat. At night, they held onto it just long enough to keep seedlings and tender greens from freezing. It was a simple method that made a big difference. She often started early lettuce, carrots, and even herbs inside these frames while snow still sat on the roof. The double insulation helped extend the growing season by weeks. There was no electricity involved, no fancy equipment, just old-world layering. For her, it wasn't about doing more. It was about doing smarter with what she had. Hardy crops like cabbage, kale, and spinach. Not everything in Grandma's greenhouse needed coddling. She knew that certain hardy crops like cabbage, kale, and spinach actually thrived in the cold. Instead of relying on heaters or extra insulation, she simply planted them directly into the winter soil. These vegetables could withstand low temperatures, especially with a layer of mulch to shield their roots. With a snug greenhouse to block out wind and frost, they kept growing steadily even when the outside world froze over. She didn't waste energy trying to simulate spring. She worked with nature, not against it. By choosing these resilient greens, she could keep harvesting through the darkest months. They offered a dependable source of food when little else could survive. For Grandma, growing these winter champions was a quiet act of wisdom, one rooted in patience, timing, and trust in the soil. Manure-heated hotbeds. Before modern heating systems, Grandma used something far more natural: decomposing manure. She would dig a trench or build a box, fill it with layers of straw and fresh manure, then cover it with rich soil. As the manure broke down, it released gentle, steady heat from below. This was her version of underfloor heating for the garden. She planted cold-sensitive crops like lettuce and beets directly into the topsoil of these hotbeds, even in late winter. The warmth from below kept the roots from freezing, and the greenhouse above trapped whatever heat was generated. She checked the temperature daily and adjusted coverings when needed. This old trick took effort, but paid off in fresh greens long before spring arrived. It was messy, smelly, and brilliant, and it kept food on the table when little else could. Clay pots sunk into the ground. Grandma had a clever trick for keeping her plants warm without electricity. She used clay pots, but not the way most people did. Instead of sitting them on top of the soil, she buried them halfway into the ground. This lets the roots benefit from the earth's natural warmth, especially during cold spells. The porous clay also helped balance moisture levels around the roots. In winter, she often used this method for growing herbs and tender greens inside the greenhouse. The pots acted like little thermal pockets, holding just enough heat to make a difference. She paired this with a good layer of straw mulch and careful watering. It wasn't complicated, it just worked. Grandma understood that sometimes survival came down to simple things placed in the right spot at the right time. Raised beds for drainage and warmth. Inside the greenhouse, Grandma built raised beds not just for neatness, but for survival. She piled up rich soil in wooden-framed beds that stood above the cold, damp ground. This extra height made all the difference. Water drained faster, preventing rot in the roots, and the soil warmed up earlier in the day. Even in midwinter, these beds gave her a head start on planting leafy greens and root crops. The elevation also made it easier to add layers of mulch, compost, or even warm water bottles near young plants. She could kneel beside a bed and feel the difference with her hands. Plants thrived where the soil stayed warm and dry. It was a small adjustment, but one she never skipped. For her, raised beds weren't a luxury. They were a cold season necessity. Straw bales for insulation. Before heaters and electric gadgets, straw bales were a gardener's best friend. Grandma would stack them along the outer walls of her greenhouse as soon as the cold set in. The thick straw acted like a blanket, trapping warmth inside while blocking out sharp winter winds. Many gardeners even blocked off the north wall completely, since it barely caught any sun. As winter wore on, the bales would slowly settle and tighten, making the insulation even better. When spring returned, she didn't throw them away. The old bales went straight into the compost pile or were used as mulch for the garden beds. It was a simple and effective trick that helped her keep vegetables alive long after frost hit the fields. Rocks inside to absorb and release heat. Grandma knew her greenhouse needed more than just sunlight. It needed heat that would last into the night. So she brought in something simple: rocks. Not just any rocks, but large, flat stones she arranged along the floor and near her plants. During the day, these rocks soaked up heat from the sun. At night, they slowly released it, keeping the air just warm enough to protect her tender crops. It wasn't high-tech, but it worked. Some mornings, when frost covered the garden outside, the greenhouse still felt mild inside. Over time, she even learned which rocks held warmth the longest. These stones became part of her rhythm, rotated and wiped down as needed. She didn't need a thermometer to know it was working. She could feel it in the plants. Black barrels of water. This was one of Grandma's most brilliant tricks for holding on to heat. She'd line the back wall of the greenhouse with black painted barrels filled with water. During the day, sunlight would warm the water through the glass. And once the sun went down, that heat slowly radiated back out into the air, keeping the greenhouse from freezing overnight. It worked like a passive heater, steady and reliable. She often placed the barrels where the winter sun hit strongest, usually the south-facing wall. Over time, she figured out just how many barrels she needed, depending on the season. Some winters, she added more and even stacked dark tiles nearby to soak up extra warmth. When neighbors asked how her spinach survived deep frost, she'd just smile and tap one of the barrels. Glass jars of water for humidity. Inside Grandma's greenhouse, sunlight didn't just grow plants. It also warmed rows of glass jars filled with water, quietly tucked beside her seedlings. These jars did more than just sit pretty. As the day heated up, the water inside began to evaporate, gently adding moisture to the air. It kept the leaves supple, the soil from drying too quickly, and prevented the dreaded leaf curl that came from dry indoor heat. In the winter, that added humidity made the air feel less brittle, especially for tender greens. Grandma swore by the method, using recycled canning jars and old bottles. Sometimes she added a sprig of mint just for the smell. It was one of her quiet tricks. Not every visitor noticed the jars, but her greenhouse plants certainly did. Fast-growing greens between crops. Grandma didn't waste space. In her greenhouse, even the narrow gaps between tomato vines or pepper bushes became miniature farms. She scattered seeds of mustard greens, baby spinach, arugula, or radishes. Anything quick to grow and eager for filtered light. These fast-growing greens thrived in between the rows, soaking up moisture and staying shaded by taller plants. Within weeks, she was harvesting handfuls of fresh leaves without disturbing the main crops. It was like getting a second harvest for free. This trick kept the soil covered, reduced weeds, and made use of every warm inch of ground. Sometimes the little greens even acted like living mulch. Her neighbors called it clever. Grandma called it common sense. Nothing pleased her more than serving salad that had grown between her cabbages and carrots. Chicken feathers, straw, and wool scraps for insulation. Not everything in Grandma's greenhouse came from the garden. She saved bits and pieces most folks threw away. Chicken feathers from the coop, leftover straw from bedding, and scraps of wool from old mending projects. These were stuffed into burlap sacks or wrapped around plant pots as makeshift insulation. They held warmth on cold nights and blocked chilly drafts from sneaking in. Some she even tucked around the base of delicate seedlings. It was soft, natural padding that breathed and never turned moldy. The warmth from these humble materials gave young plants a fighting chance when frosts came early or lingered too long. In Grandma's world, nothing went to waste, and every scrap had a second life. Even her insulation had the scent of soil and chickens. Homemade cloches. Long before plastic domes and fancy seedling warmers, Grandma made cloches from what she had. Empty jam jars, glass lampshades, and even old pickle jars were flipped over tiny sprouts to guard them from the cold. Inside each cloche, the sun's warmth gathered, holding in moisture and fending off early frost. Sometimes she lined the edges with damp soil to keep out drafts. Other times, she popped them off mid-morning so the plants could breathe, then put them back just before dusk. It was a rhythm she knew by heart. These homemade covers acted like tiny greenhouses inside the greenhouse, giving each plant a warm, safe start. Visitors might have chuckled at the patchwork look of it all, but Grandma's seedlings were always weeks ahead of everyone else's. Ash and lime on greenhouse floors. Grandma didn't believe in wasting good fireplace ash. After winter fires died down, she would sweep up the gray powder and carry it to the greenhouse. There, she sprinkled it over the floors and between garden rows. Wood ash naturally kept slugs, mold, and unwanted pests at bay. In wetter months, she added powdered lime to balance the soil's acidity and discourage fungal growth. Together, ash and lime kept the greenhouse cleaner, drier, and less inviting to bugs. This method also added nutrients back into the ground in small, steady amounts. There were no sprays or poisons in her routine, just the careful reuse of things most folks tossed out. Her greenhouse smelled of warm earth and wood smoke, and her plants stood strong because of it. Grandma's pest control was quiet, but powerful. Old storm windows as lean-to greenhouses. Grandma never threw away an old window. If it was solid and clear, she turned it into a mini greenhouse. Leaned up against the sunny south wall, these storm windows created pockets of trapped heat, perfect for starting early seeds or sheltering potted herbs through cold snaps. She added simple wooden frames and propped them open with sticks on warm days. It didn't take much, just a bit of sun and some clever positioning. These lean-tos gave her extra growing space long before spring arrived. They worked like little incubators, and by the time neighbors were still waiting for frost to pass, she already had greens pushing through. Her garden got a head start every year, not with fancy tools, but with glass, sunlight, and a little bit of patience. Vent windows high up. Grandma knew that winter sun could be deceptive. On a cold but bright day, the greenhouse could heat up fast and stress out young plants. That's why she always built in vent windows high up near the roof. As warm air rose, these small openings let the excess heat escape without letting in too much cold. It kept the air fresh, prevented overheating, and reduced the chance of mold or rot taking hold. She propped the vents open with sticks or weighted strings, adjusting them throughout the day. This simple system protected seedlings and kept everything balanced inside, no matter what the weather did outside. There were no fans or gadgets. All that was required was common sense, timing, and a respect for how air moves. Good ventilation kept her greenhouse growing strong, even in the chilliest months. Root crops in sand-filled boxes. When harvest time came, Grandma didn't rush to eat everything at once. Instead, she tucked carrots, beets, and turnips into deep wooden boxes filled with clean, dry sand. These boxes lived quietly in the greenhouse where the temperature stayed stable. and the air stayed dry. The sand kept the roots from shriveling or sprouting and made it easy to pull one out when needed. There was no spoilage, no mold, and no plastic bags. Just nature doing the preserving. Grandma stacked the boxes under benches or along the back wall where they stayed cool and out of the way. Even months later, the vegetables tasted just as fresh as the day they were dug. It was one of her most dependable storage tricks and proof that sometimes the old ways work best. Shelves along walls to grow herbs. Every bit of wall space in Grandma's greenhouse was used. Wooden shelves lined the sides, stacked with pots of basil, thyme, parsley, and mint. These herbs thrived in the warmth and sunlight filtering through the glass. Grandma knew herbs didn't need deep beds or fancy care, just a little room, good drainage, and regular pinching back. She staggered the shelves so each plant got light and watered just enough to keep the roots damp without overdoing it. This method not only gave her year-round access to flavor and medicine, but also kept the greenhouse smelling fresh and lively. Herbs were harvested in handfuls and dried in paper bags when there was too much to use fresh. Even in the dead of winter, her soups and teas tasted like summer, all thanks to those humble wall shelves. Heavy quilts or burlap curtains. When winter winds came howling, Grandma didn't rely on expensive heating systems. She simply hung thick quilts or burlap curtains inside the greenhouse to trap warmth. These heavy fabrics acted like thermal blankets, slowing down heat loss through the glass or plastic walls. During the day, she'd let in the sun, but once evening approached, she covered the structure from the inside to lock in every bit of heat. The warmth lasted longer, and tender greens stood a better chance of surviving frosty nights. Sometimes she layered them, burlap for breathability, quilts for insulation. It was a practical, low-cost method passed down through generations, especially useful in small greenhouses where every degree mattered. Today, you can still apply this method using old moving blankets or thick canvas to recreate the same simple magic. Companion crops like lettuce under tomatoes. Grandma didn't waste a single inch of greenhouse space. While tomatoes climbed toward the ceiling, she planted lettuce below them in the shaded soil. It was all about space and harmony. The tomatoes shielded the lettuce from too much sun, and the lettuce helped keep the soil cool and moist. This simple pairing reduced evaporation and discouraged weeds from creeping in. It also meant she could harvest 2 crops from one area without any extra tools or fuss. Lettuce matured quickly and could be replanted several times, while the tomatoes slowly ripened above. It was the kind of quiet wisdom she used in every corner of the garden. Nothing stood alone. Everything had a purpose, even the shade cast by taller plants. That's how Grandma kept food growing all season long. Chickens or rabbits nearby for body heat. Some winter mornings, you'd find a little pen of chickens nestled beside Grandma's greenhouse wall, not for eggs or meat, but for warmth. Their body heat added a few precious degrees to the air, especially on freezing nights. Rabbits worked just as well. Grandma would keep them nearby in well-ventilated hutches, positioned close to the structure, but shielded from direct wind. The radiant heat from these animals helped regulate the greenhouse temperature without electricity. It was a quiet trick that worked better than you'd think. Plus, the bedding from their pens could be composted later for garden use. Everything had a role. Even the animals helped grow food. This wasn't just gardening, it was a full ecosystem, carefully balanced and deeply rooted in old-fashioned know-how. These tricks weren't fancy, but they worked. Grandma used scraps, soil, and sunlight to grow food through winter without needing much else. If you've got a greenhouse, try a few of these old methods. They still work. And if you enjoyed learning about these tricks, give this video a hype and subscribe so we can keep these traditions alive for the next generation of gardeners.